The summer before college felt like the last chapter of a story that had defined my entire life. It was a summer of transition, of closing old doors and preparing to open new ones. For me, it was also a chance to escape the looming uncertainty of adulthood, even if just for a few weeks. My best friend Jake had invited me to spend part of the summer at his family's lakeside cabin. It wasn't the first time I'd been there, but it felt significant, like a farewell tour of the carefree days of youth. Jake and I had been inseparable since elementary school. He was the kind of friend who made everything feel like an adventure, even the mundane. His family, his mom, his dad Ethan, and his younger sister Mia had always treated me like one of their own. Ethan, in particular, stood out. He was the kind of man you couldn't help but admire. Charismatic, confident, and always quick with a joke. Growing up, he was like a second father to me, a figure of stability and warmth. The drive to the cabin was filled with our usual banter. Jake and I blasted music, sang off-key, and talked about everything from our favorite movies to our college plans. The cabin itself was tucked away in a quiet corner of the lake, surrounded by towering pines and a sense of tranquility that felt like a world away from our everyday lives. When we arrived, Ethan was on the porch, a broad smile on his face as he waved us over. He looked as effortlessly cool as ever, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans that somehow made him seem like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. "There you two are," he called out as we stepped out of the car. "I was beginning to think you got lost." "Blame Ryan," Jake said with a laugh, tossing his bag over his shoulder. "He's the one who insisted we stop for snacks." "Can't have a cabin trip without snacks," I shot back, grinning. Ethan chuckled, clapping a hand on my shoulder as we made our way up the steps. "Smart man. You're gonna need all the energy you can get. Jake's got this whole itinerary planned." "Don't scare him off, Dad," Jake said, rolling his eyes. "We're just here to relax." The first few days passed in a blissful haze of activity. We spent our mornings fishing off the dock, our afternoons swimming in the cool lake water, and our evenings gathered around a roaring fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It was everything I had hoped for, a perfect escape from the looming responsibilities of adulthood. Ethan was a constant presence, his easygoing nature making him a natural part of our adventures. He joined us for hikes, cooked elaborate meals, and even outdid us in a late-night game of cards. I had always admired how effortlessly he seemed to navigate the world, exuding a kind of confidence that made people gravitate to him. But as the days went on, I began to notice things I hadn't before. Subtle shifts in the way Ethan interacted with me. His jokes felt more pointed, his gaze lingering a little longer than it should. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Ethan had always been friendly, always made an effort to include me. But there was a weight to his presence now, a tension I couldn't quite place. The shift became more apparent one afternoon when Jake had to leave unexpectedly to help his girlfriend Emily with a family emergency. "It'll just be a day or two," Jake said as he packed an overnight bag. "You'll be fine here, right? Dad's around if you need anything." "Yeah, of course," I replied, waving him off. "Go be the good boyfriend. I'll hold down the After Jake left, the cabin felt quieter, almost too quiet. I spent most of the afternoon reading on the porch, the soft rustle of leaves, and the gentle lapping of the lake, providing a soothing back. Ethan joined me after a while, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "Thought you could use a refill," he said, handing me a glass. "Thanks," I said, taking a sip. The tea was perfectly sweet, with a hint of... He sat down in the chair beside me, stretching out his legs and letting out a contented sigh. "It's nice, isn't it, being out here, away from everything?" "Yeah," I agreed. "It's peaceful." We sat in companionable silence for a while, the kind that felt comfortable and natural. But then Ethan spoke again, his tone softer this time. "You've grown up a lot, Ryan. It's hard to believe you're heading off to college already." "Time flies," I said with a small smile. "Feels like just yesterday Jake and I were running around in the backyard, pretending to be superheroes." He chuckled, nodding. "Those were good times. You and Jake were always thick as thieves." "Still." "Yeah," I said, my smile widening. "He's like a brother to..." Ethan's gaze lingered on me, and for a moment, the atmosphere shifted. "You're a good kid, Ryan. You've got a bright future ahead." "Thanks," I said, feeling a flush of warmth at the compliment. The conversation moved on, but the moment stayed with me. There was something in the way Ethan had looked at me. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't bad, exactly, but it was different. That evening, Ethan suggested we use the sauna. "It's the perfect way to unwind after a long day," he said, his grin easy and inviting. I agreed, thinking nothing. The sauna was a recent addition to the cabin, and I'd only used it once, but as we stepped into the small wooden room, the heat enveloped us immediately. I sat on the bench, leaning back against the wall and closing my eyes. The warmth was soothing, and for a while, we sat in silence, letting the heat work its magic. "You seem tense," Ethan said after a while, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, though my tone was unconvincing even to my own ear. "You sure?" he pressed, his gaze steady. "You've been quiet since Jake left." "It's nothing," I said quickly, shifting uncomfortably on the bench. "Just thinking about school, I guess. There's a lot on my mind." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a big change, heading off to college. But you'll do great. You're a smart kid." "Thanks," I said, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. The heat in the room seemed to intensify, and I suddenly felt the need to leave. "I think I've had enough for now. I'm gonna head." Ethan didn't protest, simply nodding as I stood and made my way to the door. But as I stepped out into the cool evening air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The line between familiarity and something else had blurred, and I wasn't sure how to navigate. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events of the day in my mind. Ethan's words, his expressions, the lingering tension, it all swirled together, creating a storm of emotions I couldn't untangle. I didn't know what to make of it, didn't know how to feel. All I knew was that this summer, this trip, wasn't going to be what I had imagined. It was something else entirely, something I wasn't prepared for. The morning after our sauna session, I woke up feeling unsettled. The morning light poured through the window, but it did little to dispel the heaviness in my chest. I chalked it up to overthinking. Maybe I'd misread everything, the looks, the comments, the tension. Maybe it was all in my head. That's what I told myself as I got dressed and headed to the kitchen for breakfast. Ethan was already there, standing at the stove with a pan of sizzling bacon. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up with a smile. "Morning, Ryan. Hope you're hungry." "Starving," I said, forcing a smile and taking a seat at the kitchen island. The smell of bacon and eggs was comforting, grounding me in the familiar. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Ethan placed a plate in front of me, loaded with scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. He said, sitting across from me, with his own plate. "We've got a beautiful day ahead of us." "What's on the agenda?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Thought we'd take the canoe out," he replied. "The lake's like glass in the mornings. Perfect for a little explore." I nodded, not entirely sure if I was looking forward to it. Spending time alone with Ethan felt more complicated now, but I didn't want to seem rude or ungrateful. "Sounds good." We set out on the lake just as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. Ethan paddled at the back of the canoe while I took the rhythmic splash of the paddles against the surface was soothing, and for a while, I managed to push my unease to the back of my mind. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. "Yeah," I replied, glancing around at the serene landscape. The lake was surrounded by tall pines, their reflections rippling gently in the water. "It's peaceful. That's why I love this place," he said. "It's a chance to get away from everything, to clear your head." "Definitely," I agreed, though my thoughts were far from. We paddled in companionable silence for a while longer, drifting toward a secluded cove at the edge of the lake. Ethan set his paddle down and leaned back, letting the canoe glide to a stop. "Let's take a break," he said, his tone easy. "No," I nodded, setting my paddle across my lap. The quiet was almost hypnotic, the gentle lapping of the water against the canoe lulling me into a state of calm. But that calm was short-lived. "You've grown up a lot, Ryan," Ethan said suddenly, his voice soft. "It's been amazing to see the person you've become." I looked over my shoulder at him, his words catching me off guard.
Hey.
"Thanks," I said, unsure of how to respond. "That means a lot." He smiled, his gaze lingering on. "I mean it. You've got a bright future ahead of you, but don't forget to enjoy the present too. Sometimes we get so caught up in what's next that we forget to appreciate where we." "Yeah, I guess that makes sense," I said, my voice quieter. The silence stretched between us, the weight of his words settling over me. I could feel his gaze, steady and unwavering, and it made my chest. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't. That evening, the unease had settled into something heavier, something I couldn't shake. After dinner, Ethan suggested we sit by the fire. I hesitated but agreed, not wanting to draw attention to my discomfort. The fire crackled softly as we sat in the growing darkness, the flames casting flickering shadows across Ethan's face. He leaned back in his chair, a beer in hand, and let out a contented sigh. "You okay?" he asked after a while, his voice cutting through the— "Yeah, why?" I replied, my tone a little too— "You just seem off," he said, his gaze steady, like something's bothering. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he let it go, taking a sip of his beer. "If you ever need to talk about anything, you know I'm here." "Yeah, I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence, the tension between us almost palpable. By the time I retreated to my room, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But sleep didn't come easy. My mind raced with thoughts and questions I couldn't answer, the weight of the day pressing heavily on. The next morning, I resolved to avoid being alone with Ethan. I spent most of the day out on the dock, my headphones in and a book in my lap. The distance helped, giving me a sense of control I hadn't felt in days. But Ethan was never far, his presence lingering like a As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself back on the porch, staring out at the lake. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that felt both calming and icy. When I heard the door open behind me, I tensed, knowing it was Ethan before he even— "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone light. I shrugged, not trusting myself to speak. He sat down beside me, his gaze fixed on the wall. "Ryan," he said after a while, his voice quieter now, "I feel like there's something we need to talk about." My stomach twisted, and I turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. "It just feels like something's changed between us. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but if there's something on your mind, I hope you'll—" The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and for a moment, I considered telling him everything about the tension, the confusion, the way his presence made me feel. But fear held me. Instead, I shook my head, my voice barely— "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Really?" Ethan studied me for a moment before nodding. "All right," he said softly, "but if you ever change your mind, I'm here." As he stood and walked back inside, I let out a shaky breath. The storm brewing inside me was far from over, but for now, I was grateful for the tension between Ethan and me had been simmering for days, unspoken but impossible to ignore. It wasn't until that evening, under the soft glow of the living room lamp, that everything came to a head. Ethan had suggested we play a board game to pass the time, his tone casual, but the weight in his voice told me he had something else on his mind. We sat cross-legged on the carpet, the board game pieces scattered between us. I focused intently on my turn, trying to ignore the way his eyes seemed to study me when he thought I wasn't looking. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbroken, until Ethan finally spoke. "Ryan," he began, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." I froze, my hand hovering over the game piece I'd been about to move. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, though my heart was pounding. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "I feel like there's been this distance between us lately, like you're avoiding me." I looked down at the board, my thoughts racing. "I've just been busy," I said weakly, knowing how unconvincing I sounded. "Ryan," he said gently, "I know you better than that. If something's bothering you, I want to know. You can talk to me." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I glanced up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time that night. His expression was open, concerned, and it sent a wave of guilt crashing over me. I wanted to tell him everything, the confusion, the tension, the way I'd been grappling with emotions I didn't fully understand. But fear held me back. "It's nothing," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to hide things from me, Ryan," he said softly. "Whatever it is, I'd rather you be honest with." The vulnerability in his tone broke something inside me. Before I could stop myself, the words began to spill out. "I don't know what's wrong," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Everything just feels complicated, and I don't know how to deal with it." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowing. "Complicated how?" I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the board game. I don't know, I said again, shaking my... It's like, I don't know where I stand anymore. With you, with myself. I feel like I'm just lost. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then he reached out, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Ryan, it's okay to feel that way, he said. You're going through a lot right now, and it's natural to feel uncertain. But you don't have to go through it. His words brought a lump to my throat, and I nodded, unable to speak. The silence that followed wasn't heavy like before. It was filled with understanding, a quiet connection that felt like a small step toward clarity. The next day, I woke up feeling lighter, as though a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. Ethan and I didn't talk about our conversation again, but something between us had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was softer now, less oppressive. In the afternoon, Ethan suggested we take a hike to a nearby overlook. It'll be good to get some fresh air, he said, his tone casual but encouraging. We walked in near silence, the sounds of the forest around us filling the gaps. When we reached the overlook, the view took my breath away. The lake stretched out below us, its surface shimmering in the sunlight, surrounded by a sea of green pine. Beautiful, isn't it? Ethan said, his voice quiet. Yeah, I replied, my gaze fixed on the horizon. It really is. We stood there for a while, neither of us speaking. Then Ethan broke the silence. Ryan, I'm proud of you, he said, for being honest, for facing everything head on, even when it's hard. His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a knot of emotion rise in my throat. Thanks, I said softly. That means a lot. As we made our way back to the cabin, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in days. The path forward still felt uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to. The morning after our hike, the cabin felt quieter than usual. Ethan and I had reached a tentative understanding, but the air between us still carried an unspoken weight. I packed my bag slowly, the realization sinking in that it was time for me to leave. Jake was set to return later that afternoon, and I knew I needed to be gone before he arrived. The idea of explaining the complexity of what had transpired felt impossible. Ethan was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, making coffee. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. Morning, he said, his voice softer than usual. Morning, I replied, taking a seat at the table. I think I'm going to head out before Jake gets back. He nodded, his hands wrapping around his mug. I figured you might. Are you sure that's what you want? I hesitated, my gaze dropping to the table. I think it's what I need, I said finally. I need some space to figure things out. I understand, he said, his tone filled with a quiet acceptance. For what it's worth, Ryan, I'm sorry. If I've made things harder for you, that was never my intention. I know, I said, my voice thick, and I'm sorry too. I didn't handle things the best way either. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when everything that needs to be said has been spoken, leaving only understanding in its wake. As I loaded my bag into the trunk of my car, Ethan stood on the porch, his hands tucked into his pockets. Take care of yourself, Ryan, he said, his voice carrying across the distance between us. You too, I replied, giving him a small wave before climbing into the driver's seat. As I drove down the long, winding road away from the cabin, a sense of relief washed over me. The weight I'd been carrying had begun to lift, though I knew the journey to clarity and healing was far from over. Back home, the days blended into one another as I tried to process everything. I spent hours journaling, piecing together my thoughts and emotions. Talking to a close friend helped, their support reminding me that I wasn't alone in navigating this complicated chapter of my life. Ethan reached out a few weeks later, sending a simple text. Ryan, I hope you're doing okay. I've been thinking about our conversations, and I just want you to know that I'm here if you ever need to talk. Take care of yourself. Ethan. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Thank you. I'm doing better. I hope you are too. I'll reach out when I'm ready. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Months later, we saw each other again at a family gathering. The initial awkwardness melted away as we exchanged polite smiles and brief conversation. It wasn't the same as before, but it didn't need to be. We had both grown in our own ways, and that was enough. Looking back, that summer was a turning point in my life. It forced me to confront emotions I'd buried and taught me the importance of setting boundaries and seeking clarity. While the path forward wasn't easy, it was necessary, and it led me to a better understanding of myself. Ethan and I would never return to what we once were, but that was okay. What mattered was that we had faced the truth and found a way to move forward. And as I stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet sense of peace. The past was behind me, and the future felt full of possibility.